and good day, everyone. Thanks for joining this session. My name is Riccardo Mastini. I'm a PhD researcher at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. My field of research is political ecology and ecological economics. And today I'll be discussing a paper that was recently published on the journal Ecological Economics. And I'll try to bring some extra pepper to this talk by giving also, let's say, the perspective of an activist, since besides doing research on this, I'm also an activist for the Pan-European campaign, Green New Deal for Europe. And so I believe that the discussion around the Green New Deal should be grounded not just in research, but also on considerations about political openings that the climate justice movement faces at the moment. So without any further ado, I'll present you some of the key tenets of the Green New Deal discourse. And then in the last part of my opening remarks, I'll make the case for the Green New Deal to be grounded in post-growth economics. So the concept, the term of the Green New Deal was first mobilized in the aftermath of the great financial crisis of 2008 as a stimulus package focused on energy efficiency and renewable energy. Many countries mobilized this term, including the United States and the European Union. However, most governments didn't live up to their promises, and very little of their fiscal stimulus packages was targeted to green investments. The concept went dormant for about 10 years until it was revived around 2018 by a group of climate justice activists and progressive politicians in the US, among whom Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has over the last couple of years become the most known advocate for the Green New Deal proposal. So we can say that in a nutshell, the Green New Deal close a resemblance to its namesake. I heard some beeps, so somebody, I guess, asked questions. I'll take the questions at the end.
That was me. I was just making sure any questions go in the tab. Yeah.
All right. Okay, cool. Sorry, but I kind of struggle to give the talk a multitask and read the questions. So I'll take all the questions in the Q&A session at the end. So as I was saying, like its namesake before it, the Green New Deal is essentially public work projects and a social program to address the double crisis of growing economic inequality and the mounting ecological crisis. So we can say that the Green New Deal prescribes the need for an active state in the economy for doing those things that the private sector is not doing. Essentially investing and coordinating the transformation of the productive and infrastructure system at scale, scope, and speed. In a way, the Green New Deal entails fully deploying the power of the state in a historic break from the neoliberal dogma of the last 30 years. So the Green New Deal advocates the view that the ecological crisis is part of a wider social crisis caused by unbridled capitalism. Hence, Green New Deal advocates aim to solve this crisis not through market mechanisms, but rather by redistributing economic and political power. So if we accept the thesis put forward by Green New Deal advocates that the ecological crisis is a colossal failure of the free market, then it comes as obvious that the first step is to recognize the need for public interventions that go beyond the simple modification of prices, such as the adoption of a carbon tax or green subsidies. But we actually need public interventions that impose strict limits on emissions and rigid environmental standards in line with scientific evidence, which is usually referred to as command and control interventions, instead of market-based environmental policy instruments. So in a way, the ecological transition in the discourse of the Green New Deal cannot depend on a microeconomic approach when what we actually need is a new political economy. So, consistent with these premises, the Green New Deal refuses to reduce the ecological transition to a question of individual lifestyles, which run the risk of courting elitism and therefore alienating the majority of citizens. So, the Green New Deal presents the ecological transition as fundamentally a collective issue and therefore political. In essence, we can say that the Green New Deal framework operates by constantly delivering and broadcasting tangible quality of life improvements for the majority of citizens in order to win a political, in order to win over enough voters to support a deep transformation of the way we produce, consume, and live. So the Green New Deal is not just an economic discourse, it's also a political discourse, and these two elements are closely intertwined. I'll now focus on a few tenets that I think are essential to understand the proposal of the Green New Deal. The first one is the one of environmental inequality. So we know from a growing number of empirical studies that income is by far the most important determinant of environmental impact. It doesn't matter how green you think you are, if you have surplus money, you spend it. And in doing so, you grow your ecological footprint. The only form of consumption that's clearly and positively correlated with good environmental intentions is diet. Indeed, people who see themselves as green tend to consume less meat and more organic products. But attitudes have little bearing on the amount of transport fuel, home energy, and other materials that people consume. Therefore, purchasing power translates into greater ecological footprint. And we know from more and more studies that energy footprints grow with expenditure and therefore is unequally distributed within society. Footprint is correlated with wealth and income, and as there is polarization of wealth, therefore there is polarization of ecological footprint and the size of the ecological footprint. As I was saying at the beginning, the Green New Deal tries to address the double crisis of growing economic inequality and mounting ecological crisis, establishing a link between these two phenomena in the sense that now I cannot see Henry, but I guess that's not a problem. I guess you can hear me. Okay, cool. So basically, there is more and more evidence proving the fact that the more unequal a society is in economic terms, the higher the average ecological footprint is. And that is because the lifestyle of the wealthy, in a way, drives consumption to the rest of society because it acts as a sort of stimulus to try to make other people try and compete with the wealthy. So essentially, goods and services that are purchased are not because they satisfy specific needs, but rather because they act as status symbols, force the rest of society to be part of this treadmill of consumption. So in a way, addressing economic inequality is not desirable just from a societal point of view, but also from an ecological point of view. This also because by decreasing wealth and income polarization, it can facilitate the increase in the resilience of poor communities to the manifestation of the ecological crisis. This leads us inevitably to reconsider also the policies that are proposed, that are put forward in order to deal with the ecological footprint. So the Green New Deal shifts the emphasis away from the use of carbon taxation, since this type of direct taxation delegates to the law of supply and demand the shifting consumption habits. In a way, the economic logic of the carbon tax stems from the idea that we are all equally responsible for the climate crisis, and therefore we must all internalize the negative externalities that our consumption habits entail, regardless of whether these are to satisfy essential needs or luxury wants. The problem is that this kind of microeconomic approach that focused on the carbon molecule has regressive and therefore counterproductive effects on the articulation of a progressive environmental discourse. So the nexus between economic and environmental inequality that I previously discussed constitutes essentially a significant barrier to instigating environmental change through the price mechanism. The carbon-centric approach of the carbon tax can disproportionately impact lower-income families who spend a larger share of their incomes on fuel and home energy and the rest of it. So the fiscal lever that needs to be used to foster the ecological transition is not the one of direct consumption, but rather is the one on wealth and income taxation. So Green New Deal proponents argued that if we want carbon taxation to be fair and effective, first we need to tax wealth and drastically reduce inequality. And also the sequencing with which we adopt policies is crucial. So before taxing carbon, we must offer people alternative ways of meeting their needs. Hence, taxing wealth should also be a means to expand fare-free and carbon-free public services. In a way, this is what many Green New Deal advocates point out as being the main lesson from the Yellow Vest protest in France that happened in 2018. So you cannot tax people's access to energy unless you provide them with affordable and public alternatives. The point here being that the most vulnerable in society have less discretionality on how to spend their money, and therefore just using price signals to nudge their consumption habits can backfire. So this element of inequality and the adoption of wealth of, let's say, progressive tax system goes hand in hand also with the rethinking about the role that work should have in an ecological transition. So the Green New Deal aims to overcome the historic disagreement between the protection of the environment and the protection of work. So the Just Transition framework is one of the cornerstones of this proposal. The strategy put forward here is to promise benefits from the ecological transition to a sufficient number of workers so as to bring together a winning political coalition. This is particularly important for gaining the consensus of the deindustrialized areas where far-right parties in many countries are getting lots of political support. Because the production and installation of renewable energy plants, the retrofitting of buildings, the repairing of objects and appliances, just like small-scale agroecology, are all activities that can create many jobs and that are difficult to delocalize to other countries. Therefore, a reshoring of industrial activities in order to provide the technology, the installation, the maintenance of renewable energy plants and other, let's say, and other infrastructures necessary for the ecological transition is very important to tackle the issue of growing unemployment. But in addition to creating green jobs in the private sector, one of the flagship proposals of the Green New Deal is the job guarantee. The job guarantee is a permanent, nationally funded program that supplies employment opportunities on demand for all those who are ready and willing to work at a decent living wage, focusing on community needs not met by public services. So the job guarantee gives public authorities the duty to fund the employment of anybody who wants a job but cannot find one in the private labor market. And this is particularly important in the context of the ecological transition because lots of the activities that need to be performed are not profitable from the perspective of the private sector and therefore are neglected by companies. So work provided through the job guarantee should be channeled toward any activity considered socially desirable since it involves production for use rather than for exchange. So Green New Deal advocates argued that a job guarantee should shift income and welfare creation from industrial production and towards a social and environmental reproduction. This means an increased role of work focused on the maintenance and repair of the built and natural environment, just like an increased role of work focused on care activities, such as education, medical support to an aging population, and community service. And I think that these arguments are all the more convincing in the aftermath of the pandemic. I hope you can still see me and hear me. Great. Another element that is pivotal to the Green New Deal proposal is the public ownership of essential infrastructure. So the argument here is that the electrification of the energy system and its decarbonization can be facilitated by bringing strategic sectors for the green transition under public ownership. This derives from the fact that investments in renewables will bring returns in much a longer time frame than private companies expect, while cooperatives and municipalized companies instead operate with lower profit requirements. So while some investor-owned utilities are starting to shift to renewable energy, their compulsion to recoup their sunk costs and obligation to generate shareholder profits continually impede progress. And this should not come as a surprise. After all, clean energy and the low carbon infrastructure is a public good. And historically, governments have directly provided public goods, such as healthcare, roads, the train system, the sewage system. So in all these cases, governments do not incentivize private firms to build them, but rather they either build them themselves or contract with firms to build them. But in either case, it is the government that coordinates construction and operations and finances all this directly from the public purse. So treating the climate crisis as a public infrastructure challenge rather than a private market failure brings a whole range of advantages that pricing and regulation on their own cannot provide. For example, it enables long time horizons that private investors are unlikely to tolerate. It enables planning and coordination across sectors of the economy to integrate infrastructures and institutions. And also, it enables low-cost public finance that could make the price of the energy transition far more manageable. All these points are argued very strongly, among others, by Mariana Mazzucato, who is an economist who has inspired many of the thinking around the Green New Deal. So these considerations, of course, should extend beyond the energy sector and pertain all the sectors that are essential for the ecological transition. So water, railways, broadband, waste recycling, the housing sector, and tightly linked with bringing under public, either municipalized or state-owned or cooperative-owned infrastructure is the attempt to decommodify the provision of public services. Here the idea is that the ecological transition focuses on the material conditions that people face in their daily lives, such as the way they move, eat, power, and heat their homes. So the Green New Deal rightly centers on sectors like housing, energy, food, and transport, and claims that we can both decarbonize and decommodify these sectors to create better lives for the vast majority of people. So the way is that by decarbonizing these essential infrastructures, we can also decommodify them, meaning that we should remove them from the market logic and subject them to the logic of the commons. And that is, and the reason for this is that this the provisioning of these essential services should be administered based on social and political considerations rather than merely economic ones. And also because we know that the public provisioning of this infrastructure is not only more economically efficient than their private counterparts, but it's also more ecologically efficient because of their economies of scale, better coordination, better considerations on provisioning of, let's say, required services rather than provisioning of services that just come with a higher price tag. And this leads me, I'm going to cut it short because I've been already kind of used up all my time for the presentation, and I would like to leave some time for the Q&A.
Feel free to talk an extra couple of minutes because
yeah,
you lost
great.
a
Yeah,
couple
I'll
of
speak 5 more minutes and just jump to why I think that Green New Deal for in order to live up to the climate challenge, ecological challenge, should be grounded in post-growth economics. So here is the idea. Here the idea is that a growing body of empirical evidence proves the fact that there is actually no absolute decoupling happening between GDP growth and environmental impacts. All decoupling, meaning let's say the track record of countries of being able to grow GDP while decreasing environmental impacts is usually very limited in time, space, and sectors. And of course, it's not enough to prove that the coupling happens for very limited environmental impacts, like waste recycling in a canton in Switzerland for a couple of years. But rather, what we need is a decoupling that is in line with our climate targets. So we know that based on existing data, this is not happening, at least fast enough and at a scale that is able to allow the global economy to keep on growing while decreasing environmental impacts. So the idea here is that we should find a way of pursuing an ecological transition that is socially just without a constant aggregate, without constant compound growth. And more and more data proves that this is possible, because some countries are able to perform much better than others on indicators of human development with much lower levels of income per capita. The truth is that the interventions that matter when it comes to improving human welfare do not require high levels of GDP. And proof of that is the fact, for example, that the European Union as a whole has a 36% less income than the United States. And yet it beats the US not only on life expectancy, but on virtually every indicator of human welfare. But there are even countries that are usually defined as developing countries that manage to achieve high levels of human welfare with low GDP per capita. For example, the country of Costa Rica in Central America surpasses the United States on many welfare indicators with a GDP per capita that is only 1/7 that of the US. And at this point, many of you may be wondering, what explains such remarkable results? Well, the point is that when it comes to delivering long, healthy, flourishing lives for all, what counts is investing in high-quality universal public services, which are significantly more cost-efficient to run than their private counterparts, as I was saying before. However, since the 80s, endless waves of privatization have been unleashed on education, healthcare, transportation, housing, even social security. So social goods are everywhere under attack. And I would argue that this is a purposeful strategy. The idea is that by making public goods artificially scarce, people will have no choice but to purchase private alternatives, meaning citizens end up paying to acquire goods that they used to access for free. And what happens when you enclose a good that used to be accessed for free? Essentially, what happens when you force people to pay for healthcare instead of accessing it as a human right? Well, GDP grows. GDP grows because money changes hands. And what happens is that by enclosing public goods, you create artificial scarcity. For instance, the hospitals are still there, and yet they don't provide the services to all citizens as they were doing before. So this is a form of artificial scarcity, it's not a real scarcity. And this form of artificial scarcity and growth creates a self-reinforcing loop. So to stimulate growth, you need to enclose public goods, for example, to give the opportunity of through privatization of investments to expand in spheres that before were, let's say, outside the sphere of commodification. But in order, let's say, for citizens then to access these privatized public goods, then they need to have a constantly increasing income, and therefore they are eager to support an economy that grows, because in our growth-based economy, that means that there is an increase in employment, and let's say there is the ability of all aspects of our economic system to function, since they're dependent on growth. But here the proposition, let's say, of post-growth is that if scarcity is created for the sake of growth, as I've just explained, then by reversing artificial scarcity, so de-enclosing, deprivatizing public sectors, we can render growth unnecessary. If we expand the commons, we can enable people to access the goods that they need to live well without needing high levels of income and therefore additional growth. In this way, people would be able to work less without any loss to their quality of life, and in so doing, they would also produce less unnecessary stuff and generating less pressure on the biosphere. So, of course, the economy in this case would be smaller in terms of GDP, and yet it would be more abundant in terms of welfare. So, in a nutshell, we can say that the Green New Deal without growth would call for abundance in order to render growth unnecessary. I'll leave it at that, and I'll be glad to hear any comments or questions in the remaining 10 minutes.
Thank you. That was great. I came into this not knowing too much about the Green New Deal, and now I know quite a lot. So thank you. Have you got time to answer a few questions then?
If I still have time to answer a couple of questions.
Yeah, if you could answer a couple of questions, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Sophie here. Top one is, what do you think of Joe Biden's climate pledge?
Yeah, well, I think that it's a step in the right direction, and I think that comes as the result of a very active mobilization from the part of the climate justice movement in the US, and also from a mobilization of let's say, the more radical left-wing parts of the Democratic Party that had originally campaigned for a Green New Deal. So I think that if Biden's plan falls short of the ambitions of the Green New Deal, and yet he lays the foundation for some interesting elements that can be expanded and radicalized, hopefully, in the years to come. Some of them is, of course, the infrastructure and investments is putting forward, the increase in the climate targets for the US, but also in some more niche, let's say, proposals that are not being discussed much in the news, and yet I think that are very promising. For example, is reviving this idea of a sort of a climate conservation corps, which was another public work project that was set up by President Roosevelt in the New Deal. Essentially, the idea was to recruit young unemployed people to contrast the soil erosion in the Midwest that at the time was the cause of the Dust Bowl. Yes, and basically he is setting up a project of this kind again, and I think that this can be in potentially a first step towards a job guarantee targeted on green activities. Of course, this core that President Biden is setting up for short of a job guarantee, and obviously will not have the same macroeconomic impacts that a job guarantee could have. And yet I think it's a right step in linking the decommodification of work through public work projects to the fight against the climate change, both in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation. So without having a very deep knowledge of Biden's plan, I think that there are a few elements that make me hopeful. So that that I think is something to start from in fighting for a Green New Deal.
Thank you. It's a first step, basically, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm trying to read the other questions. So for example, you pick. Sure.
Maybe answer the one about Texas, if you can see that one. That one was quite interesting.
Okay. Well, I do believe that there are some regions, some states that are going to be more negatively impacted by the ecological transition than others. And in the case of the US, I assume that Texas would indeed be one of those. And yet, I think that there are some openings, opportunities also for these regions/states that are very dependent on fossil fuel extraction to play a role in the ecological transition. And one of these is because I think that, yes, we need to dismantle fossil fuel companies, but we don't have to abandon the know-how of the workers that work in the fossil fuel sectors. And this is because lots of the infrastructure that we need to set up in place to provide to provide the distribution of renewable energy, but potentially even for some forms of CO2 capture, for example, through direct air capture. I think that the know-how of fossil fuel workers can be useful. So I would say that pitting, in a way, these workers against the ecological transition is not just politically short-sighted, but I think also runs the risk of foregoing a very valuable set of skills that instead I think need to be turned towards the pursuit of a renewable energy system and the build up also of a different kind of infrastructure. So I think that is a way in which regions and states can be won over.
Yeah, I had not thought about that at all. They just use it as a political tool almost in places like that, don't they? Have you got time to answer one or two more?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Let's answer Ellen's here. Can you see Ellen's, which starts with great talk?
Yeah. What do you see as the largest political obstacles to a Green New Deal without growth? And despite potentially large obstacles, do you feel some optimism? Yes, of course, I feel some optimism because there is, I think, a growing awareness of the fact that campaigning or arguing for the ecological transition disconnected from the question of growth is increasingly widespread. The knowledge and the awareness that these two discourses needs to go in tandem. I think that there is going to be, of course, a strong resistance from the part of industry and from the part of the most wealthy, who, of course, would feel the burn of a change in policies that focus on environmental justice. Environmental justice, as I was explaining in my opening remarks, predicated upon the need to reduce inequality in our society. Just yesterday, I think the Financial Times reported a quote from some representative of big business in the US, criticizing Biden's tax hikes, saying these tax hikes are going the wrong direction. What we should be doing instead is carbon taxation. And as I was arguing in my talk, I think that carbon taxation is also a new strategy, I think, from big oil to slow down and postpone the adoption of radical and strong green measures. So I think we should be wary of that. First of all, because of their let's say regressive impacts on the most vulnerable in our society, but also because it's it's a price-based mechanism, and I think that big fossil fuel companies know that it would encounter stronger political resistance, and in a way this would be a way of slowing down process. So instead focusing on reducing the emissions of the rich and publicly financing the transformation of our infrastructural systems are more direct and effective ways to spearhead the ecological transition, and that I think would also kind of be able to circumvent some of the resistance that is set up, that is put forward by big industrial interests. Then, of course, on the question of how to move beyond the growth-based system, that's a more complex one, because our growth-based economic system came into being as let's say as the result of the growth of the capitalist system. So I think that moving beyond that is going to be a political challenge that is going to require more time, and probably is a deeper historical transition than just transforming the infrastructural system or productive system in a way as let's say as the Green New Deal or the whole discussion about the green transition is about.
Thank you.